computations. Okay, recording. I will talk about strategic computations in the brain and applying of reinforcement learning type models to strategic behavior. And it's not going to be a tutorial. I will not cover, the whole literature or anything like that. But I will talk a lot about the work I did with my co-authors on this topic, and I hope it's going to be interesting. So just a standard first slide to prove to you that strategic computations are everywhere. So we see the strategic decisions in daily lives all the time. So we all play all kinds of games and sports, for instance, chess, or people play video games, people play basketball, football, and so on. And all these activities involve some kind of strategic decisions and competition. And also markets are competition. So when two companies decide what products to bring to markets and how to set their prices and so on, that's all also based on some strategic considerations. And finally, politics is another example, good example of strategic behavior when you have to interact with other politicians and they have to interact with the public. And there's a lot of strategic thinking going into long-term thinking, also short-term thinking, and so on. So what is common between all these things? What are strategic decisions in general? So what we call strategic situation is mainly based on game theory, which is a field that's been developing for many years, since 1950s. And it has a very simple definition of a strategic situation, or a game, as they call it. So typically what you need to have for a strategic behavior is some set of players, or we can call them opponents. If we talk about competition, this is mainly the topic I'm going to be talking about this today. So you need at least two players to have a game. Then you have some actions and sometimes action history. So you need to have some decisions that the players are making. And then you have some outcomes or payoffs that are based on these decisions. And so these players are getting some payoffs, getting some outcomes for themselves. And typically these are monetary outcomes if we think about neuroeconomics or think about market decisions and so on. But they can also be just, winning in a game or things like that. So once we have this set up, we can try to model this and try to predict what people are going to do in these situations. And the way we do this typically these days in complex interactions that are repeated multiple times is we assume that players assign some values to actions. Then they have some beliefs that they form about what the opponent is going to do and about the future states they can end up in if the game is more complex. If you think about chess, for instance, what kind of positions you're going to have on the board. Then there's some value or belief update mechanisms. So if the opponent is doing something you didn't expect, you have a violation of expectations, you have to update your beliefs about the game situation, about the opponent, and so on. And there's some mechanism of choice. So you're playing this game, for instance, chess again, and you can move your rook, you can move your pawn, and you're not sure which one to move. So you have to make some choice based on the values that you assign to actions. So today I'm going to talk about all these different components of computations that go into strategic behavior and how we look at this with brain data and what we can infer from brain data about this. So since it's a MindRL hub, I guess I don't have to talk too much about reinforcement learning. And I saw that you have some excellent talks about reinforcement learning in the past and the brain as well. So it's well known. So I'm not going to I can give a whole lecture on this, but basically there's a well-known reward and learning system in the brain, which involves the dopamine system and dopaminergic system that projects in other areas such as ACC and prefrontal cortex. And so we roughly know, so this is a very much of a simplification of how it works, but we roughly know that the dopaminergic system learns the values of things or values of actions, and then the values of actions can be stored in PFC, for instance, and then compared in ACC, and then the action is executed. So this is a very rough idea of how these things work in the brain. Now, when you add a social dimension to this, things get more complicated. So over the years, we also have some idea about what the social brain is or what the social brain network is. And this is usually a set of areas in the brain that are activated when we deal with some kinds of social situations. And this can be a lot of different situations. And typically, when people see these activations, they compare a decision that was involved some other human being versus a decision that did not involve a human being, for instance, or a decision that involved some complex mentalization thoughts when you were thinking about what the other person is thinking versus a decision which was just a story about people doing daily things. And all this kind of different regions show up as being important for this decision, social decisions. And the two regions that I've been looking at quite a bit is the medial prefrontal cortex and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which is in the front of the brain here, and the temporal junction, which is in the back side of the brain. And these regions seem to be involved in different computations underlying social decisions, and they seem to be interacting also with the reward regions, because some social interactions involve reward. But again, social interactions are super complex. They can involve not just rewards, but also encoding who other people are, their emotions, affections, and things like that. So for us, it's very interesting to investigate how these regions perform computations related to learning and reinforcement learning of value, and how this value is distributed between yourself and the other person, and so on, and in a dynamic way. I would also recommend a very nice review paper by Pat Lockwood and Matt Apps, who are also here in Birmingham, on the social brain, where they talk about how some computations might be very similar between non-social and social decision making. And so it's not even clear if there's a specific social brain as a separate network, or there's a lot of overlap and functions of different regions of the brain. So how do we study strategic learning in the social brain? So like I said, can be a lot of different complex computations that people do when they interact with each other. So we need to simplify this as much as possible to be able to study this. And typically we do this with very simple games, simple strategic games. And here's one example: is rock, paper, scissors. And this is what we use in our latest paper that I'm going to show towards the end. But it's also similar to other games that I'm going to be talking about this today. So you probably all know rock, paper, scissors. So the game is very simple. You choose one of three options: paper, scissors, or rock with your hand, and then rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, and paper beats rock. So I guess the errors here are a bit confusing. And if you just play this game once, it's very simple. And game theory predicts you should just be random. So the person cannot predict what you're doing. And if they're also random, you're going to get some random outcome. But when we make people play this game in real life multiple times, they're not just random. They use some strategies. They see what the person is doing over time with their opponent. They try to adapt to that. They try to predict what they're doing. And so by just using this simple game, we can already create a level of complexity that is quite difficult to study, but we're trying. And we try to use that to understand the process of thinking about what the opponent is doing and how this can bring more benefit to me. And so there's no like social benefit component here. It's a purely competitive game. So we don't have to worry about altruism or things like that. So what kind of strategies people use in this game? And typically we think about what we call strategic sophistication, or levels of thinking. And there are three levels, but you can think about that I'm going to talk about today, but you can think about more levels of strategic thinking. And there's different ways to define these levels and different approaches, but here's how we typically do this. So you can think about RL, basic reinforcement learning, or you can think about some other types, and we actually explore some other types of thinking for this basic level, because people might have different ideas how to behave in this game. But you can think about RL as the level 0. So basically here, rock works for me. Just I'm playing rock, it gives me some reward. So I'm going to reinforce rock. I'm going to play it more often. And I can just use a standard reinforcement learning rule for this. So I'm going to compute the prediction error. So if I get a reward, I update my value of this action using some learning rate. And so if something gives me a reward, I'm playing this more often because I'm updating the value upwards. And if it's not giving me a reward, I'm updating the value downwards. So very simple strategy that almost anyone can use, and you don't even have to pay attention to what the opponent is doing. Now, if you're a bit more sophisticated, you can use the strategy used as a fictitious play. And so simply if that plays rock, I can play paper. So if you see that someone is playing rock too often, 90% of the time, 80% of the time, then you should be just playing paper all the time, because you're going to beat them most of the time. And you can just literally compute the frequency of their choice. But you can also use some kind of reinforcement learning idea, and that's what we did, and some other people did some papers. You basically just track how often they choose one of the options, and then update this frequency using, again, some learning rate. So here, instead of the reward itself, you just take the opponent's choice and just track how often they choose one thing or the other. And basically, this converges to the probability that the opponent is going to choose rock or paper or something like that. Now, if you're playing to someone who's following this strategy and you want to try to be even a bit more sophisticated, you can use a strategy known as influence play in the literature. So in simple words, if Bart saw me play rock, I know he'll play paper, so I'll play scissors. So I'm one step above level 1. And I can do this the same way by looking at what I was playing in the past. And if we expand this equation, we can add the opponent's beliefs about what I'm doing. So now, instead of tracking what the opponent is doing, I'm tracking what I'm doing myself. So Q is my action. And again, with some learning rate, I update what is the action that I'm doing. And so now my full belief is going to be computed based on fictitious play and also influence play, influencing what the opponent is doing by looking at my own actions. And so there can be different levels of play, and there's been some research in trying to understand how exactly the brain implements this different computations and what we can do about it. So typically what we do is we fit this computational model to the choices, and then we compute this update signals. And you can, look at if you look over a bunch of trials in the game and you see what you chose, what the opponent chose, suppose there was only 2 options, yes or no. And then you can see whether you won, you lost in this trial, and see whether this is tracked in the brain, typically in the ventral striatum. But you can also look at the fictitious play update, influence play update. So these update signals that I showed on the previous slide here, like this update or this update, based on what you did or what the opponent did. And you can also see how this changes, how this signal changes over the course of the game, up and down. And you can use a brain analysis to see where in the brain this is implemented. And so some previous literature show that this fictitious play update, just tracking what the opponent is doing, seems to be implemented by the DMPFC here in the front of the brain. And the influence learning update seems to be implemented by the TPJ, the area in the back of the brain. And yeah, this was basically the original paper was by Hampton et al. In PNAS in 2008. And so they separated reinforcement learning, fictitious play, and influence play, and they show that these different areas track different beliefs. And then some co-authors of mine did a paper in 2017 where they applied TMS to TPJ, so magnetic stimulation disrupting activity in the TPJ. And they found that first it affected the rate of influence play in the subjects, but also affected the connectivity between TPJ and DMPFC. So it decreased the connectivity between these areas, and it decreased the amount of influence play in using of second order belief. So TPJ seems to be causally involved in these computations. Now, the next question we asked after this study was, is this belief updating a social phenomenon? Is there something specific about interacting with the other person that makes TPJ activate or makes DMPFC activate? Or this is just because of the nature, the strategic nature that I'm doing something that the opponent is reacting to, the opponent is reacting to me, and so on. So we used in our MRI study, which came out a few years ago, we used a very simple game where you just had to choose between tree and rock, and the opponent is choosing between tree and rock. So they had like kind of 2 cards on the screen. And basically, if you guess right what they chose, if you guess the tree or guess the rock, you get a point. If you don't guess right, then they get a point. So very simple, what they call a matching pennies game. So you just have to guess what they're doing. And then what we did is we put them in different contexts, social, non-social contexts, and we did this between subjects. So we told half of the subjects, you're playing with a real person outside of the room. And then we told half of the subjects, you're playing with a computer. It's just 2 decks of cards with trees and rocks in them, and you just have to, beat the computer. But actually, both groups of subjects were playing against the same 2 opponents that we programmed. And so we basically used deception for the social group, because we told them there was a real person, even though it was just a confederate. But they played against a computer algorithm, which was basically a bot programmed according to these algorithms that I talked about before. And so we had two algorithms, one we called learner and one we called sequencer. And basically sequencer was kind of level 0 person and learner was level 1 person. So here how it worked. So basically a learner was a Bayesian model that was tracking what the opponent or the subject was doing and then making the choice based on that. So if you were hiding this coin behind a tree or behind a rock too often, if you were choosing tree too often, then this learner would choose the opposite option. So it was tracking what you're doing in the past trials. Very simple algorithm. And then we matched in complexity this to a different algorithm, which was called sequencer, which didn't pay attention to what the subject is doing. And it was just playing a sequence of choices, which was just tree, rock, rock, and there was a bit of noise on top of that. So very simple strategy. And basically by doing this 2x2 design of this, we looked at two conditions that people typically don't look at. When you play a non-social game with a computer, but it actually is reacting to you, even though we didn't tell them anything about the algorithms. We're just saying like there are two opponents, you're playing one and then the other. And so this condition, when a card guessing game is reacting to you, is pretty unusual for people. And then a social sequencer algorithm can also be unusual because it's a person who's playing with you, but they don't seem to be reacting to you at all. And so by looking at this 2x2 design, we could see if activity in the brain is related to social or non-social condition, like people looked at the past, or related to the nature of the computation that is happening in the brain. And what we found is it's not on the slide because we found no significant difference between social and non-social condition across both opponents. So there was no difference in brain activity. But we found that the social brain areas activated quite a bit when people were playing against the learner, the active opponent. So these areas were more active than they played against the passive sequencer opponent. And this overlapped quite a bit with theory of mind areas based on meta-analysis. But we also found that the social winning did matter quite a bit. So TPJ was activated more when you were winning in social condition compared to when you were winning in non-social condition. So there seemed to be no overall social effect, but some effect about type of reward you're getting, whether social reward or non-social reward. So we looked a bit more into how people play the game using some modeling, the one I described before. So in this plot, I here have a reward rate, how often people were winning. And so here I'm splitting by social, non-social condition. And in blue, I have the sequencer passive opponent. And pink, I have the learner, the active opponent. And when people played against the learner, the active opponent, they were winning more often in the social condition. So they were being more active and winning more money. And when we looked into modeling, and so then we fit a model like I showed you before, influence play and fictitious play. So kappa here is basically paying attention to your own past history. So this is influence play, and gamma is paying attention to the opponent history. So fictitious play. And we found that against learner, people were using more influence play as expected, and against sequencer, more fictitious play as expected. Basically, if you're playing against the learner, you're also making more money if you use the correct strategy. And so we found that people in the social condition were more likely to use this correct strategy. They're more likely to alternate between their options, trying to influence what the opponent is doing. And then what we did is we looked at so there's way more results in the paper. I don't have time to cover all this today, but we looked at some regions of the social brain, a bunch of different regions, and then we ran GLMs of various variables. And here we're looking at GLMs of these strategy choices where you're using second-order beliefs, influence play, or first-order beliefs, fictitious play. And here we found a way to present MRI GLMs in a table. So this is sort of a regression table. So the values here, the T values basically. And what we do is we just look at all these different regions and then just run a regression of activity in this region on the value of the strategy in a specific run. So this is on the run level. And we found that specifically in the social condition, People were the amount of influence play, the parameter kappa, was correlated with activity in the TPJ, the MPFC, and precunious, the social region. So specifically in the social condition, they were choosing this strategy to be more unpredictable, and this was implemented in the brain. So social regions here did not reflect just pure presence of another person, but they reflected the choice of what to do against this real person. So, and then this is a bit of a segue. After we got those results, we thought, what if the social brain can do something else completely? What if all results we're finding about the social brain is just about some basic computation that is common between very different tasks, and we're just seeing them because this computation is happening in social tasks and non-social tasks and so on. So we wrote this other paper, which is still a preprint. It's on bioRxiv, you can look it up. But we're working a new version because we need to change the terminology a little bit. In style salience-based information integration, so the function of the social brain. So the idea is that maybe the social brain regions just have something to do with integrating information. And there's no learning here, but what we were thinking is that when you do social processing, and for instance, you see a group of people, I'll show you this photo and ask you, what do you see? And you see, well, I see 3 people. And nothing else. There's not much to say. Okay, 2 are men, 1 is a woman, and you didn't know much about them. So then I show you this other picture, and you look at them, and this is a more complex interaction. You immediately can look at this guy and infer something. Okay, he feels left out. There's maybe something happening between them, and so there's more complex mentalization going on in the brain, and this is what typically pictures or stories that are shown to people when they do social tasks, that there's a bit more complex interaction going on here, but it also means that the whole process of integrating information is more complex. You're not just looking at them and seeing, oh, these are people. You're looking at them and seeing, oh, they're looking here, they're looking there, this guy's face is upset. And so the processing, the computation is more complex. And maybe there's just that complexity of integrating information is causing an increased activity in the social brain. And so what we did is we designed a task which had no social dimension whatsoever, but we thought we would see activity in the social brain. So the task is very simple. So I will start here. We have 2 clouds of dots that are shown sequentially. So you see one cloud first and then the other cloud. And then you need to tell us which cloud has more dots, the first cloud or the second cloud. And in a salient condition, in the very simple basic condition, you need to count all the dots. You need to tell us, is there more dots in the first cloud than in the second cloud? So this is a very simple processing, like detecting the 3 people in the picture. In a more complex alternative condition, you need to tell us, is there more blue dots in the first cloud or the second cloud? So you need to look more carefully. You need to think about blue dots, separate them from the red dots, and so on. So this kind of corresponds to the second picture that I showed you before. You need one more step of reasoning. And this is sort of our basic idea, or our theory, is that you have some sensory and memory inputs, and then you form some representations in your brain, and then you form some responses based on these representations. And we think if we manipulate the mappings from these inputs to these representations, then we modulate activity in the TPJ in the social brain. But we would not do that if you modulate the mappings between representations and responses. So again, we had a 2x2 design where we manipulated what the task was, like which cloud you should choose based on the total number of dots or just specific dots. And the second condition was response mapping, which was manipulated when the default one, or the salient one, was that you press a button once for the first cloud and a button twice for the second cloud. And the alternative condition, you need to press button twice for the first cloud and once for the second cloud. So it's a bit more complex, a bit more unusual. And it requires additional mental effort. And so our prediction was, unfortunately, we did not pre-register that, and we should have done this, and this is a good advice for everyone. We did not pre-register that, but we found what we expected. We basically found that when we look at the stimulus mappings between the default condition and alternative condition, we see exactly the regions of the social brain, DMPFC and TPJ, which overlaps with some meta-analysis of social decisions. But when we look at the response mappings, which are also a bit more difficult, but they had nothing to do with processing the inputs, they had more the outputs, we saw the typical cognitive control areas like DLPFC and IPL and so on, and some other areas in DMPFC. So that's a bit of a deviation from learning, but that's like some ideas that I'm thinking about quite a bit about how computations can be similar between social and non-social tasks, and we need to understand how different brain areas do these computations. So now I want to shift gears a bit and move into choice. So is decision making different or special for strategic or social choices? And when I talk about decision making, I'm talking about making a choice. So like I was describing, you can learn the values of actions, but then you need to make a choice between them based on these values. And there's a lot of literature in the non-social domain about choices and how they're implemented in the brain. And for instance, this paper by Polanyi et al. In Neuron, where they look at choice, it was value-based choice between two different snacks, but also perceptual choice based on how bright or how big the pictures of the snacks were. And what they found is, sorry, apologize. What they found is that you can find this ramp up of activity in EEG that corresponds to so-called derivative diffusion models that before you make a choice within the trial, there's some ramp up of activity that corresponds to the value of the options that corresponds to the choice that you make. And then these derivative diffusion models were also applied quite a few times to reinforcement learning models as well. So there's a paper by Fontanesi et al. That combines reinforcement learning and derivative diffusion models in a very simple bandit learning task. So you can predict both response times, but also the choices of people when they learn these things. And then me and Ji Hu had this paper. Well, he was the first author. I was just in the middle. We had this paper where we looked at altruistic decisions when people were deciding between choosing two different outcomes, monetary outcomes for themselves and another person. We found that the same process of evidence accumulation can be found in social decision making. And so in parallel with that study, we also did a study where we looked at strategic decision making. So we put people in EEG and they played this game where they had to choose H or T, and they knew that the opponent is going to choose up or down. So here on the screen, you see H and T. For instance, you choose H, and then if your opponent chooses up, you get 50 points. If your opponent chooses down, you get 0 points. And this table just shows you what the outcomes are going to be. So remember, like I was talking, strategic situation, you just have some choices, you have some outcomes, and you have the opponent, and that's how a game would look like. So this was a simple game, and people play this repeatedly with the real subjects this time for 400 trials. So that was a very long game. And we used EEG to record the brain activity. And what we tried here for the first time, I believe, is to combine the choice model that predicts response times, the derivative diffusion model, and the influence model or the reinforcement learning model of learning what the opponent is doing. So here's kind of a basic, so this without math, just a basic scheme of the model. So we assume that the person is assigning some values to H and T. They compute value difference, then they enter the derivative diffusion model. I will show this in a second at some point how this works. And the derivative diffusion model produces choice and response time. A new choice, like I showed before, goes into the influence update, and fictitious update is influenced by the opponent's choice, and that forms total belief update and that forms the values of the options. And so the idea was that to see or to predict that when you have the choice onset, you should be computing the value difference. When you make a response, you should be computing this DDM process. And when you see the feedback, you should be updating or learning the values of learning the belief and learning the values of the options. So we found that using a DDM instead of standard softmax choice model doesn't make your predictions about choices better. It's about the same level of predictions, but you can also explain or predict response time. So you see this typical curve where easy decisions, when the values between options are very large, are very fast, and the difficult decisions when values are close to each other, they're very slow. So we can do that. which means it makes sense to look at the brain as well. And so first, we took a look at the during feedback. So when you receive feedback, and remember, we have this fictitious play update, which was found in DMPFC, and influence play update, which was found in the TPJ. But with MRI, you cannot tell when exactly these updates are happening, whether they're happening the same time and one after the other, or so on. And so what we found is that 3 separate signals for reward, fictitious play update, and influence play update, and they happen sequentially, sort of. They overlap a little bit, but the fictitious play update happens a bit earlier in the feedback stage, and the influence play update happens a bit later. We cannot tell specifically that these correspond to these areas based on the EEG data, but based on the previous literature, we can expect that. Then we look at the choice stage and we ask, does EEG signal reflect choice values? And the values of H and T. So you have to make a choice. You have some values in your mind, whether H or T gives you more reward, and you need to make a choice. And what we found is, yeah, we can see the value difference in the EEG signal. We can see the previous trial influence update. So it carries over to the next trial. And we see when we align the signal to the time of response instead of the onset of the trial, we can see the value of the chosen option. So the option that you chose in this trial, and we see that some sort of accumulation process going to the same threshold, but it's happens in different speed based on the different values of the options. So that made us look at the distributed diffusion model, and here, as I promised, just a quick recap. I guess you might be familiar with that. So the model is just basically the model of choice and response time in any decision. And here, the first time you're applying this to strategic decisions, when the drift rate, or the rate of which you accumulate the evidence toward one of the options, H or T, is changing over time. And we assume that this drift rate depends on the values, the relative value of the options. So using this model, we can predict both RT and choice distributions. And then when we simulate the model after we fit to the data, we see quite a similar curve as we see in the EEG data. So this relative decision value accumulates to a specific threshold, but it can be a bit different depending on the strength of value of the chosen value, 200 to 300 milliseconds before the choice. And then what we do is the method that we used, that our lab has used in previous papers, is that look at the odd trials and identify electrodes where this signal is correlated with DDM accumulation over time. And we find this. So basically here in the parietal area, we see positive signal, and in more frontal area, we see more negative signal. And then we predict EEG signal in the even trials based on this model from the odd trials. So the model here is in red and the data is in blue. And we see the model overlaps quite well with the electrodes, and we look at this peak in the parietal area. So we can predict how the accumulation signal is going to happen based on the trial variables. And then what we do is we look at the central parietal connectivity measured as a lag of between the signals, and we look at the evidence accumulation area and the chosen value area, because we assume that when you accumulate evidence between the two options, you compute which options you want to choose, and then you make a choice, and that produces the chosen value. So these areas must be communicating with each other, and this communication might determine how well people are doing. So we found that there's significant coherence in the gamma frequency band between these two regions. And then for each subject, we extracted the amount of coherence, so how coherent the two signals are. And we found that the p-value are not super strong. This was exploratory analysis, so I would not bet my house on this. But we found that there's a significant relationship between both performance and influence play with the coherence of signal between these two areas on the subject level. It's not super strong, but and also the p-value is not super great, but seems to be there. And then in our more recent paper, we thought more about this, and we're thinking about more individual decision-making, individual mentalization, and whether we can predict individual ability to mentalize based on neural data. and based on computational models. So here, again, it's a preprint, which is on SciArchive, I think in this case, we put out a couple of months ago. And if you go to my website, you can find a link to the preprint. So we used the rock, paper, scissors game, basically. So we have 3 options, and I explained how the game works before. And what we did is we thought about these different levels of play, as I explained before, level 0, level 1, and level 2. And we programmed computer opponents again that play at these 3 different levels. And the subject is playing 6 different, they're told they're playing 6 different opponents, and 2 of them play at level 0, 2 of them play at level 1, 2 of them play at level 2. And the subject, again, is deception. So then they're an MRI scanner, and we tell them you're playing with online subjects, even though all this were computer opponents. So we could control really well what the opponents are doing, because when you make people play against each other, we often can do very basic things and not play at high sophistication levels. So with computer opponents, we can get to these high sophistication levels. So the task was very simple, an MRI scanner, right? So we have 3 options. We did not present them rock, paper, scissors. So just 1, 2, 3, and you just basically have to be 1 ahead of your opponent, and then you win. We have 97 subjects. So we have a first sample and then replication sample, so 50-50. And we replicated almost all the results in the replication sample. And we very carefully spent a lot of time programming these bots and testing them that they can be indistinguishable from humans. So we played, so humans played against each other, but also against the bots in pilot studies, quite a few pilot studies, and they were calibrated. So when they ask these people, do you think you're playing against a human or a machine? They equally tell that they cannot distinguish between bot levels, level 1, level 2, for instance, here, and human, how they're playing. So they're kind of passing the Turing test. So we programmed these bots, and they're playing this in MRI. And we introduced this model called Chase. And the idea of this model, again, you can look at, I don't have time to go into details about this model, but the idea is that in addition to all this computations, different levels, if you're very high level, if you're level 2, you can expect your opponent to be either level 0 or level 1. So if you're playing against bot level 0, level 1, you can also be level 3. So you can expect your opponent to be level 2, level 1, level 0. So about 3 different bots. And once you play a little bit with the opponent, you can infer based on what they're doing, whether they're level 0 and don't pay attention to you, whether they're level 1 and they respond to what you're doing, or whether they're level 2 and play influence play, and you can try to beat that. And this model, the Chase model, assumes that you can, as you go through the game, you make a distribution, a belief distribution about what kind of bot you're playing against, what kind of level of opponent you're playing against. And if you see, it's a Bayesian model, and if you see that the opponent's playing too much like level 0, you increase the belief that they're playing level 0. If they're playing like level 1, you increase the belief that they're playing level 1. So it's a very adaptive, what we call adaptive mentalization model. So you mentalize what other people are doing, the opponent is doing, but you try to adapt to their style of play and to their sophistication. And we found, so this is a Xenos probability for model fitting, and all these different colors, different samples, including an MRI sample. And we see that this model that we produced beats some other very simple, like fictitious play model and EWA model and simple reinforcement learning and so on. And yeah, the full description of the model is in the paper. So yeah, please take a look if you're interested. And like I said, yeah, the key feature is that it's a very, I'm not sure it's a very informative diagram, but basically A here is your choices. So you have your choices, you have B, the choices of the opponent, and then you compute beliefs about what you are doing, what the opponent is doing. And importantly, this what we call LK is your belief about what level is the opponent playing. Are they level 1? Are they level 2? Are they level 0? And so on. And so you basically can update this belief as you go through the game. And we think this is quite important. And in chess, for instance, it's pretty important to understand what level your opponent is playing at, but also in other domains it can be important. And we also have a companion paper, which is, it's not public yet, but it's using the same model and the same task to look at autistic patients and to see if this adaptive mentalization is different in autistic individuals. And what we found is, again, if we look at the same brain areas, we found that this belief update about the opponent level is encoded in the TPJ and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, here DLPFC on the left. And we see action prediction error also encoded in TPJ and DMPFC. So this, on one hand, is consistent with previous results. On the other hand, it's something new because we now see that there's also more complex process going on. Even though the game is very simple by itself, it just choose out of 3 options, rock, paper, scissors game. And then, importantly, what we tried is we tried to decode the belief update from the brain data. And I forgot to include this slide here, unfortunately, but we looked at the full brain, we looked at the social brain, and then each region separately. And we looked at the multi-voxel patterns, what kind of patterns, and how we can decode for the subject from their pattern of activity, how much they update the belief about the opponent. So if the belief update was high, it means they updated quite a bit. If it was low, they don't update it a lot. So basically, they do more mentalizing if the belief update is high as a parameter per subject. And we found we can decode this parameter from the brain data. Oh, sorry, there's some kind of, I guess if you show down, it shows negative. We can decode this this belief update from the brain data out of samples. So we do like permutation testing, and we permute the labels, and we correctly, not at perfect correlation, but pretty high correlation, I think 0.8. We can, by looking at the brain data of a person in this task, in the left out run, we can predict how well they do this mentalizing in this game. So yeah, that's quite exciting. And then, like I said, we applied this to autistic individuals as well. And what we found in that sample is that this decoding is diminished in autistic individuals. So if we train the data on neurotypical individuals, we cannot infer this as well in autistic individuals using this multi-voxel pattern. So this seems to be quite different in terms of how the brain implements adaptive mentalization. Okay, and just to summarize everything I was talking about today and the studies that we did in the last few years. So some of the studies are published, some of the studies are still not published, but preprints are available. And if you just Google my name, you can find my website and links to all the papers and take a look. So it seems to be that a social brain network, which identified through all kinds of tasks which are not computational. And the 2 main nodes of this network are DMPFC and TPJ. And this network seems to perform strategic computations. And an important part of that is belief updates in terms of probabilistic beliefs about my opponent is going to do this or my opponent is going to do that. And we assign some probabilities to that. And this include all kinds of different beliefs. So this can be first order belief updates. What is my opponent doing? How often they're playing one thing or the other? And this typically found DMPFC. Second order beliefs updates. How do my actions influence the opponent? And this seems to be encoded in the TPJ. Then we found the choice of strategy more of a long-term variable in terms of what should I be doing against this opponent if it's a social situation, for instance, seems to be encoded in DMPFC. And then there's also can be more complex process, adaptive mentalization, also encoded in the TPJ as well. And then these belief updates, they form values, which are used to execute choice. And it seems to be very similar to non-strategic decision-making. So there doesn't seem to be anything special about social or strategic decision-making in terms of how values are formed and then executed into actions. And the process we found was very similar to the driven diffusion process that we see in perceptual decision-making and snack choice and all kinds of other choices. So thank you very much for listening. I just want to thank my co-authors on all these papers, mostly people from Zurich, although some of them left Zurich now. And I want to thank our funders who funded this work, and thanks very much for listening. And yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thanks for your introduction. I don't do social, but I think your area is really interesting. So is there any question from the audience? You can just open your mic or drop your question in the chat box.
I think, okay, yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah,
Hi.
I just want to make sure in the hide-seek game, in the non-social condition, do participants have any prior knowledge about the reactive nature of the machine?
No, they don't. No, we just tell them that you're playing two opponents and you're playing against the machine, but we don't tell them at all what the strategy on the machine is. Not at all. We just say, just play the game and do whatever you want, basically. Yeah.
Got it. And I'm wondering, how can we rule out the possibility that the participants have prior about reactive or not reactive component opponent versus social or not social? Yeah.
Yeah. So we thought about this idea for a long time and a lot, about priors and how we could try to capture these priors. Because we also thought, it makes sense that you have priors that the human is going to be more reactive and the machine is not going to be non-reactive. And we try to implement models with priors and see how they change. Unfortunately, because of the nature of these models in the reinforcement learning, any priors get washed out very fast in computations and basically within the first 5 trials or something. And so we could not find any reliable signal or understanding that they did have these priors. Maybe by just asking them we could find them, but this is a very interesting question. I mean, we thought about this, and we just felt that with the data that we have, the brain data, it was not possible to answer that. But I think it's definitely something that should be and could be explored in terms of how we approach interactions in advance, what we think about the opponent and how they're going to behave. Yeah, so great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice talk.
Thank you. Sorry, Yanan, you're muted if you're trying to say something.
So is there any other questions? I have two. So for the rock, paper, scissors game, is it only for 2 people? Or because I think if there are multiple people playing this game at the same time, the strategy would be slightly different.
That's a good question. So, I mean, the classic rock, paper, scissors is just 2 people. Yeah, you're right. But you can expand this to 3 people, and then there's a bit more coordination that's going to be involved. And we haven't thought about this, but you're right that this can definitely create more complexity in terms of beliefs about what should this person do, what should other person do. And so, yeah, that's a good, I think, it could be a good direction to explore. I'm a bit worried that already the complexity of the models that we have is very high. And if you introduce more people, it get even higher. But you're right that in real life, we do interact with more than one person quite often. And so, yeah, that's definitely something to explore. Yeah, I'm involved in the project here. It's still in very early stages here in Birmingham when it's a multi-person game. It's not a rock, paper, scissors game. It's more of a cooperative game, but there's also competition in terms of it's kind of foraging game, and some people go forage and people don't. And then you have to pay attention to what multiple people are doing. So it's very early stages. I think they're planning to do MRI, but I think we're going to see more work with multiple people, definitely. Yeah.
The MR scanning, you mean like hyper scanning or?
No, not hyper scanning. It's just one person in the scanner, but then the multiple opponents outside of the scanner.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And in the MVPA analysis, you mentioned that the autism was defected. I'm wondering, can you see which brain areas are defected?
Yeah, so I think I'm not the first author, right? So I don't remember all the details. I mostly was involved in modeling and things like that. I think it was whole brain
Mhm.
primarily. So the pattern we trained was on the whole brain.
Yeah.
And then I think I did raise similar question at some point, whether we looked at whether predictions vary by different areas, but I haven't looked at the paper for a few months now. So I'm afraid I don't have the answer. But when the paper is out, yeah, I'm going to share it on Twitter and everywhere. So it's almost ready to be public. We're just waiting for a little bit. But yeah, since I don't remember there was some specific region, I would assume we probably just did the whole brain. But it's also an interesting question because we thought about this because TPJ, and PC have different functions. So it'd be interesting to see if the autistic individuals have different patterns in different regions. But we might not have this data because the best prediction we were getting was from the full brain. So I think we might have just used the full brain. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll follow too. So, any other questions? You can also post your questions in the chat box if you don't want to open your mic. One more minute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting. It was really nice to prepare this talk, and this I think the first time I have like a talk that combine all these different papers together. So I think it was interesting to build a more of a cohesive picture of strategic decision making, and I hope it was useful. And yeah, like I said, if you go on my website, you find all the papers and preprints and yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a very cool initiative you have in the online talks, and I would recommend other people to do this as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And by the strategic decision making, because there's a slide you mentioned all the features of the strategic decision making. I think compared with non-strategy decision making, the part involved with small players is the unique features of it, or is there any other like significant difference?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. First, basically it becomes strategic when there's another person.
Yeah.
If your actions affect another person and their actions affect you, that's strategic. But at the same time, sometimes like if it's a dictator game, I'm just choosing how much money to give to you. It's not very strategic to me, right? My decision affects you, but it's not strategic. It has to be like back and forth process, more or less. So like both actions have to affect each other. That becomes strategic. And then yeah, I had a second thought. Yeah, and then people sometimes separate social and strategic in a sense that if it's sometimes people say about competitive games that is strategic. When I'm competing with you, then I have to devise some kind of strategy. If we're just deciding how much money to share or how like to organize something and we're just cooperating, then sometimes people don't see this as strategic. So it's more of it's not a definition, but it's more like often people think strategic implies competition more than cooperation. But I do have some work in cooperation as well. And sometimes there is strategic decision making in cooperation, like in Prisoner's Dilemma and so on. So I do have one preprint on Prisoner's Dilemma and currently working on MRI study. So the data is collected also on MRI study in Prisoner's Dilemma. But there's no learning there. So it's not strategic because there's no updating about the other person. We just make them make decisions in Prisoner's Dilemma without seeing what the other person is choosing. So it's also interesting, like either strategic now or not, because you don't see what the other person is choosing. You just try to make one choice. So yeah, there's multiple components going into that. But like I said, if you look at game theory, the basic definition is simple. It's just basically if you have two players at least, and then actions affect each other, then it's strategic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah. And also basically, so just one thing also, if you're really interested in this topic, I really recommend also looking into some game theory like literature, and Colin Kammerer from Caltech. He's big in neuroeconomics, and he has a great book called Behavioral Game Theory, on also reinforcement learning models and game theory. And there's a lot of interesting, useful information there about strategic interactions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit outdated now, but it's still a very good classic book. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
If there is no questions, that's for today. Thanks you for coming and listening. Yeah.
Thanks for
Have a
inviting me.
good day. Yeah.
Have a good day. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.